All right, so today we're diving into the life of a really fascinating figure, Pope Pius XI. Now, here's a guy who was a scholar, even an avid mountain climber, who found himself leading the Catholic Church just as communism, fascism, and Nazism were beginning to cast these enormous shadows across the globe. This is the story of how this one man faced down one of the most chaotic periods in modern history, pretty much head on. So you gotta ask, how did a scholar pope even begin to navigate a world like that? Well, that's what we're gonna break down. First, we'll look at his journey from the library to the papacy. Then, we'll tackle the massive 60-year-old political crisis he solved. After that, we'll dive into the social blueprint he laid out for the world, his high-stakes showdowns with dictators, and finally, what it all means, the legacy he left behind.
Okay, let's start at the beginning with the man himself, Achille Ratti. Before he became Pope Pius XI, his life was, well, it was quiet. He was a scholar, a historian. His whole world was ancient manuscripts and dusty archives. But that world was about to get turned completely upside down in a way he never, ever could have seen coming.
And this phrase here, this was his North Star, the peace of Christ in the kingdom of Christ. Think of it as his personal mission statement. It's the lens he used to look at a world that was just fractured by war and these new radical ideologies. And for him, this wasn't just a saying, it was the goal, the solution he was going to dedicate his entire papacy to trying to achieve. And it's easy to picture a pope as this remote figure. But you gotta remember, before all the weight of the papacy was on him, he was a real man of the world. I mean, we're talking about a globe-trotting librarian. And get this, he's almost certainly the only pope in history who ever rode on top of a double-decker bus in London. Just kind of a fun fact. And his rise through the church, it was absolutely meteoric. I mean, think about this. In 1912, he's the head of the Vatican Library. Fast forward to 1921, he's appointed Archbishop of Milan. And then, just 1 year later, boom, he's Pope. In just 10 years, the man went from the quiet of the archives to the absolute epicenter of global spiritual and political power. It's an incredible trajectory. But you know what? He never forgot where he came from. He always had that librarian soul. In fact, one of his very first passion projects as Pope was to drag the Vatican Library kicking and screaming into the 20th century. He brought in American experts, had miles of modern steel shelving installed, and got the latest cataloging systems put in place. He basically turned it into a world-class, state-of-the-art institution. Okay, but his papacy was about a lot more than just upgrading libraries. He inherited an absolute political firestorm, a problem that had pretty much paralyzed the Vatican for almost 60 years. It was called the Roman Question. So what was this Roman Question? Well, here's the short version. Back in 1870, when Italy became a unified country, the Pope lost all his territory. And I mean all of it, including Rome itself. So all of a sudden, the head of the global Catholic Church was basically just a citizen of Italy. This created a huge standoff. For the next 60 years, every pope before him refused to even set foot outside the Vatican. They called themselves prisoners in the Vatican to protest this total loss of independence. And it's really important to get what was at stake here. The popes weren't trying to get a massive kingdom back. That wasn't the goal. What they needed was just a tiny foothold on the earth, a piece of land that belonged to no other government, to guarantee that the pope's spiritual role could never be held hostage by a political power. So Pius XI sees a path forward, and it runs right through Italy's new fascist leader, Benito Mussolini, a controversial partner, to say the least. But he dives into these incredibly complex negotiations, and what do you know, he comes out with the Lateran Treaty. And this thing was a masterstroke. First, it creates Vatican City as a fully independent sovereign state. Second, it gets financial compensation for all that lost land. And third, it establishes Catholicism as Italy's official state religion. Just like that, in one fell swoop, he solved a problem that had stumped the papacy for 60 years. Now, here's the really brilliant part of this deal. At the time, a lot of people saw it as a huge win for Mussolini. It gave his regime a ton of credibility. But historians now look back and say, no, Pope Pius XI was the true victor here. Mussolini got a short-term PR boost, but Pius XI, he got permanent independence and secured the financial future of the Holy See. He didn't just end a crisis, he guaranteed the Church's freedom for generations to come. All right, so with the Vatican's physical independence now secure, Pius XI could turn his attention to what he saw as an even bigger problem, the moral and spiritual health of the modern world. He looked out and saw a society that was just adrift. He called it a kind of moral, juridical, and social modernism, and he was absolutely determined to offer a solution.
And his solution came in the form of 3 major encyclicals, which are basically formal letters from the Pope to the whole Church. And together, they form this sort of triple crown of his social teaching. The first one took on education, arguing against a purely secular approach. The second one was all about the ideal of Christian marriage and family. And the third, Quadragesimo Anno, was this really powerful critique of the way wealth was concentrated in the hands of a few, and it proposed a whole new social order. He was building a complete vision for society from the ground up. But here's the thing. This grand vision for a Christian social order was on a direct collision course with 2 of the most destructive ideologies the world has ever seen. Because while Pius XI was writing and teaching, totalitarianism was on the march across Europe. A confrontation wasn't just likely, it was absolutely inevitable. And then, in March of 1937, he did something truly unprecedented. In the span of just 5 days, he basically declared a 2-front war on these ideologies. First, he released an encyclical called Divini Redemptoris, which was a powerful condemnation of atheistic communism. And then, just days later, he followed it up with Mitbrenden der Sorge, a direct, searing attack on Nazism in Germany. And the story behind that anti-Nazi letter, Mitbrenden der Sorge, I mean, it's like something out of a spy thriller, seriously. First off, it's the only encyclical ever written in German, so the message would be crystal clear. Then, it was smuggled secretly into Germany to get past the censors. It was printed in a massive covert operation and distributed in secret. And then, and this is the amazing part, it was read aloud from every single Catholic pulpit across Germany on Palm Sunday, completely surprising the Nazis and leaving the Gestapo absolutely furious and caught off guard. And the message itself? It pulled absolutely no punches. He wrote, "Whoever exalts race, or the people, or the state, above their standard value and divinizes them to an idolatrous level, distorts and perverts an order of the world planned and created by God." This wasn't just a political disagreement. It was a direct theological attack on the absolute core of Nazi ideology, the worship of race and state. So when you look back at all of this, the diplomatic wins, the social teachings, the battles with dictators, what is the lasting legacy of this indomitable pope? How did he really reshape the papacy for the modern world? Well, for one thing, he was this man of powerful contradictions, which is what makes him so interesting. He was a traditionalist to his core, but he jumped at the chance to use cutting-edge technology like the radio to get his message out. He was a high-level diplomat who would sit down and negotiate with dictators, but at the same time, he built up grassroots organizations, these lay groups called Catholic Action, to act as a counterbalance to fascist power on the ground. And if you need just one number to really understand his diplomatic impact, here it is, 10. Between 1922 and 1933, he successfully negotiated 10 Concordats. Those are formal treaties with nations all across Europe. And these weren't just pieces of paper. They were absolutely vital for securing the Church's legal rights and freedoms in a world that was changing fast and was often becoming incredibly hostile. So in the end, his legacy isn't simple, and you can't put it in a neat little box. Here's a pope who was pragmatic enough to make a deal with Mussolini, but also courageous enough to publicly condemn Nazism, knowing the enormous risk. His story really leaves us with a tough, timeless question, doesn't it? How should we remember leaders who have to make these kinds of controversial, morally complex choices when the world around them is basically on fire?